We're speaking with businessman and serial entrepreneur David Shaw. We had so much to cover, we broke the podcast into 2 segments. Part 2 continues now. David, there's a well-known quote which says, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." You're certainly not a dull person by any means. Besides being involved with companies which employ hundreds of thousands of people, you also have an adventuresome side to you. Tell us about your hike to the summit of Kilimanjaro, Africa's tallest mountain and the highest freestanding mountain in the world.
Happy to. And I think the adventurousness of spirit associated with geographical exploration rhymes nicely with adventurousness of building these companies. So it's the same mindset, I think. To go out into the world and explore and discover and dream. And you probably are familiar with the 7 summits, so the highest summit on each continent. I had some friends that wanted to do that, and our first choice was to start with Kilimanjaro. And I love Africa. I've spent a lot of time there. As 20,000 foot mountains go, this one is relatively easy. It's not technical climbing.
Right.
Some people would think of it as an easy 20,000 footer, but it's very adventurous and it's at a beautiful setting. And so we went up something called the Machami Trail and took a couple of days to get up on top. And it's a wonderful feeling of success and fulfillment to get up into that thin air and do that.
So David, I also did Kilimanjaro with my children when they were 13 and 16.
Wow.
And it took me a lot longer than 2 days. I think it took us 7 days. Did you sprint up the mountain, or is there an auto road I didn't know about?
I said a few days, and it certainly was not 2 days. We acclimated at 15,000 feet or so, but it was part of a plan of mine to roam around the world and see some of the world's great seascapes and landscapes. And so I also climbed in Patagonia, Machu Picchu, hiked across the Tibetan Plateau, hiked around in Bhutan around the famous Jomolhari trek, and same thing in ocean seascapes. So I feel blessed to have seen
Good part
amazing
of the world.
parts of the world.
Now you also have gone skydiving.
Yes.
Did you do that on a certain birthday?
I went skydiving once earlier with all of my children in the South Island of New Zealand, in Queenstown, the adventure capital of the world. Mm-hmm. So we went skydiving and bungee jumping and a few other things there. My birthday is on Earth Day, and this year it wasn't easy to celebrate with a lot of other people because of the pandemic. So skydive from 14,000 feet over Austin, Texas seemed like the perfect thing to do.
You just turned 70.
Yes.
Diving?
I love to scuba dive. I think the underwater world on the planet is the least explored part of our planet. It's spectacularly beautiful and interesting. And so I've been a scuba diver since I was a teenager. Switching
now to University of Maine, you gave a commencement address, I believe. You were the speaker. Yeah. And you played the harmonica.
Just before I was to give that commencement speech, I asked some friends if they could remember who their commencement speakers were and what they said, what their messages were.
Nobody could remember.
And no one could remember. And so I said, here I am in my hometown giving a commencement speech to these students. And I want to get them to remember it. And I've known as a leader in companies and nonprofits that people often pay more attention to what you do than what you say. So after making a few comments, I asked the national anthem singer to come back up on stage, and handed her some lyrics that I'd handwritten on the program. And I pulled out a harmonica and asked her if she knew Beethoven's Ninth, which she did. And we then played Joyful, Joyful Graduation. And when I'm around town, I could be checking out at a grocery store or something. Someone will say, I know you, you were my commencement speaker. And I'll say, what were the key points? And they actually do remember. And my 2 key points were always in your life, try to understand, have a perspective on what great looks like in what you're doing, whatever you're doing, understand what great looks like. And 2 is always challenge convention. The challenging conventional thinking and conventional wisdom is a healthy exercise.
David, you've been involved with the Museum of Art here in Portland.
Yes.
In fact, there's the Shaw Family Art Park. What motivated you to create that?
What motivated me to establish that sculpture park is that I find that I'm very influenced, and many of my friends and colleagues are very influenced by art, by the statements that artists make through their work, through painting and videos and any kind of art. To me, the physicality and the three-dimensionality of sculpture, and especially outdoor sculpture, puts it in a special category. And especially when you can view these sculptures and have kind of a private conversation between you and the artist that created the sculpture in nature. I think it's like hearing a poem. It's like listening to some music. And so I thought that would be a great experience to have in Portland, Maine. And that small lot adjacent to PMA was not being used. And so we created a small park with some beautiful work that's also open to the public. So it's outside the paywall of the museum, and you can simply, like you can in many great cities in the world, you can wander off the street into this beautiful park and have it influence your mood and your thinking.
It's like a sanctuary almost.
Yeah.
David, you are a survivor of viral encephalitis.
Yes.
Back in July of 2011, you came down with this disease. From what I understand, it nearly killed you. You made a full recovery. If you can explain for our viewers what viral encephalitis is, how you got it, what caused it, and what's the process you went through to overcome it, and how did playing music help you heal, and how did filmmaking play a role in your recovery? Because it's an incredible story.
Well, I'd never been hospitalized for anything meaningful in my life. And suddenly, one night, after some diving in the Mesoamerican Reef, after coming home from that, I realized something was dramatically wrong with my brain. It was in horrific pain. I lost feeling in my hands. I couldn't see very well. And after attempting to drive to the hospital, I called an ambulance and went in, and because of my background in science, I was trying to go through a checklist of what this could possibly be. I'm a lifetime sufferer from migraine headaches, but I knew this was not that. I had taken some migraine meds and it wasn't helping me. So I suspected that somehow I might have an infectious agent in my brain. I'd read about that. It's very, very rare, but I knew enough from my life in the world of diagnostics and molecular diagnostics to, in the ER in 3 or 4 in the morning, ask them to do a molecular test, what we all know now as a polymerase chain reaction test, or a PCR test that we get for
Like COVID.
For COVID. IDEX had developed some of those tests, and so I asked for a PCR test on spinal fluid, which they thought was an unusual request, but they did it and it was positive. And so they found virus in my spinal fluid, and that is a full-on emergency. The idea that you have a virus replicating in your brain is very, very serious, and I knew enough to know that I was at risk of not making it. So people that I knew had developed in the days of developing AIDS drugs had developed a drug called acyclovir, which inhibits the replication of viruses, and they, with my help and others at this point, including an older brother who is an MD. We quickly got me on IV acyclovir and got into an ambulance and went to Mass General, where I'm very fortunate that I knew some of the senior people there from businesses that I've been in and from the world of AAAS and science. And so they received me very quickly and processed me into the hospital. But I had gone into a coma at that point. And so this is just hearsay for me, what I'm told. I was diagnosed with a viral infection in my brain, and specifically in the right frontal lobe of my brain. And I was losing the cognitive functions that operate out of that part of the brain. I was in a coma for days. There was a question about what life would be like after that. And I wasn't able, as a patient laying in bed in the neurotrauma ward of Mass General Hospital, it was hard for me to process what had happened to me. But because of my life as an entrepreneur, I was determined to kind of defeat and survive this.
And the survival rate, by the way, on this is very low, right?
So the survival rate is very low. And even worse than that is if you survive, you're cognitively disabled and you maybe can't live a normal life. I had wonderful help from these doctors, and I remember marking time, just a terrible day by day, not understanding who was visiting me, what they were saying to me. But my daughter Liza was having a baby in a few months, and she would come and visit. And it was one of the few things I remember in terms of motivation was that I would like to be there to see this baby, see this grandchild, her first child. Things like that is kind of one day at a time to try to get through it. And then we live in this golden age of neuroscience where there's been a sense of something called neuroplasticity, that the brain can heal itself. Neural networks can remodel themselves against mindful intentions. So an example might be if you try to learn a new language, or you try to play a musical instrument, or you try to do something new that at first you can't do that, but when your mind sees that you're trying to do that, your brain your brain responds to that in terms of creating neural networks that make that possible. And in that sense, I think of the brain as the car maybe, and the mind as the driver. And so I started to do those exercises. When I was well enough to be discharged, I went home and started playing music, and I started making films. And it was a big effort for me to figure out that one photo should go in front of the other photo and what the story was. And slowly but surely, though, my efforts to exercise the neural networks that weren't working, not unlike you exercise your muscles, that I started to see some results.
And you told me when we spoke before that if you were at the dining room table, you would have to consciously put your phone in front of you so you would remember where it was.
You do a lot of self-talk. So maybe I'll go back a little bit and say in the specific part of my brain that was damaged was impacted functions like short-term memory. I literally wasn't recording. I didn't lose memories of my life, but I was unable to record new memories. So like putting a phone down, that simply wasn't recorded as something that ever happened. And visual spatial recognition, I couldn't recognize things. I had a hard time finding my way around my house. And then a complicated set of functions called executive function and other things. My smell and taste were wrecked. I really was unable to consume anything other than these little bottles of vanilla Ensure, it's called, because no other food, taste, or smell was tolerable for me. But so what happens? The retraining happens. To use your example of putting the phone down. My practice, and I think the practice of people that do this kind of contemplative science, or people might call it mindfulness, is to talk to yourself and say, I am putting the phone down. I'd like to remember that I put the phone down. I hope I can remember it. And then maybe you don't. But you try it again. And so all day long, you're kind of talking to yourself saying, okay, I'm going for a walk and I want to remember how to get home. And that talking to yourself, that inner voice, that sense of witnessing yourself, that sense of self-awareness, has an impact on remodeling those neural networks in ways that we still don't totally understand.
And because of this, you became friends with Deepak Chopra?
Yes, Deepak Chopra and I talked when I was in the hospital, and then he did some one-on-one meditation sessions with me. And then Deepak and I went to India for a couple of weeks to a meditation retreat to study these mindfulness issues in much greater detail with other people that were like-minded.
So from the time you caught the virus to the time where you were fully functional, how long was that?
Well, one could say it's still happening, Greg.
I knew you were going to say that, but from an outsider's perspective, I mean, you're there. I mean, there's no deficit I can see.
I wouldn't wish what happened to me on anyone. I do wish that all of us could understand the miracle of our brains and understanding consciousness and knowing how we create reality out of all these sensory perceptions that we get, and how fragile it can be. But even more than that, how much power we have individually as humans to influence the way our brains operate and the way the neurochemicals create moods. You know, the way our cerebral cortex, which humans have a cerebral cortex that can override the primitive emotional brain that might get angry about something, and we have this cerebral cortex. We have this ability to say, no, don't do that. No, don't get angry. Don't get depressed. Don't allow yourself to do that. And we all have more power to do that than we think. That part of my recovery is something I wasn't fully aware of in the first place, but I'm fascinated by now. The ability to drive happened maybe 6 months after my injury. I was allowed to drive again. I could go to meetings. I resisted. I wanted to have real life, the way I wanted to experience it, be my cognitive therapy. I didn't want it to be going back to junior high and doing flashcards and classroom exercises. And so I think that had a lot to do with my recovery.
So are you of the opinion that you can control your state of, say, happiness?
Yes, I know you can.
You know, just a quick aside, my former wife years ago said to me, she goes, Greg, you know, you're not happy. You just think you're happy. And I go, well, if you think you're happy, you're happy. And I don't know if that's similar to what you're talking about.
I would call the amount of moods, happiness that's a choice is dramatic. You can choose what to think about, and you can think about things that are happy. You can experience things that are happy. You can be with friends. You can walk in nature, and the neurochemicals produced by that thinking in your brain, by seeing things that make you happy, we produce this complex stew of neurochemicals, and we have a great deal of control over when and how we produce those.
Very interesting. Switching subjects just a moment. Earlier we talked about Earth Day. What is your connection to Earth Day and the moon landing in 1969? Because Earth Day was started 1970, Earth Day, and the landing on the moon was 1969, I believe. Right. Is there a connection?
I happened to be graduating from high school, and the moon landing happened as I was going to college. And there are few things in human history that can compare with something that dramatic. And just the idea that human ingenuity and adventurousness and a sense of discovery had led to something that amazing and that remarkable, of course, got everyone's attention. The photo, though, that those astronauts took looking back at Earth, changed the way the world thought about the place we live. You know, this little blue planet, where we've never found anything like it in the universe. And we finally saw it from a distance after centuries of thinking it was flat and, you know, all kinds of unknown things about the Earth. We suddenly had the technology and the capability to see our planet in a different way and to know that it's a finite resource. It gives a sense, I think, when you understand something and you love something, like you have to love the planet you live on, you sometimes feel different about the way you care for it. And so Earth Day was born out of that kind of thinking.
The watershed moment, really.
Yes.
Another topic. While working for Governor Longley when you first got out of college, you wrote a bond issue which financed the Portland Fish Pier. And is that what first attracted you to the Portland waterfront, where you initially put IDEX?
Some of what I did with Governor Longley is related to something I talked about a few minutes ago, which is the extension of national jurisdiction out to 200 miles. So that created a different way of governments, including the state of Maine government, thinking about our marine resources. Suddenly it had been 3 miles and then 12 miles, now it's 200 miles. And the question is, how can we be stewards of that? And also, what kind of industry might we create instead of foreign fishing vessels fishing in those areas? Now it was ours to be stewards of. So there were other commissions happening in the Longley days, including the Commission on Maine's Future and a commission to study the seacoast and seacoast uses. And one of the things that people worried about was that key working waterfronts were getting shrunk by developments that weren't part of the working waterfront. It was residential or recreational development. And so when you think about all the things that governments can do to benefit society, one thing they can do is build roads and create access. And I, with the Commissioner of Transportation at the time, Roger Maller, we said to the legislature and to the government, let's think of building fish piers as simply building roads and infrastructure, public infrastructure, to protect forever the access to the working waterfront, so that we don't wake up someday and find that it's gone. It was a wonderful experience for me because I got to go up and down the coast to all these harbors and get to know the fishermen that made a living there. Once earlier, when I first moved to Maine, I had gone out on a 150-foot fishing boat on the Portland waterfront and fished way off Nova Scotia and decided that lifestyle, that career was not for me. But I'm glad I did it. It was an amazing experience to see what it's like to make your living that way.
It gives you real respect for those guys who go out there in all sorts of weather.
Yeah.
Hey, David, what's the Shaw Innovation Scholarship Award, and who gets it?
So the Shaw Innovation Scholarship Award is a program that was developed to recognize the great importance of innovation, disruptive thinking, adventurousness, where some of that might get less attention than grade point average and academic excellence. In my working career, I've found that some of those qualities, courage, resilience, courageousness, entrepreneurship, sort of challenging the conventional wisdom, that those are more valuable in terms of creating value in the world than what your grade point average was. So I wanted to create a program that kind of rhymed with my life, where I was not a top student, but I was a adventurous student. And I found that that adventurousness and that challenging of convention has served me well. And I want to be sure that students hear that that's important in their lives and to support them financially.
And so is that an annual award?
Yes, it's an annual award, and you self-nominate. Faculty members play a role in curating the whole process, and then a handful of people are picked to get a financial grant and to be recognized, and also to be mentored by people whose lives have been highly influenced by the kind of attributes that we're encouraging.
You know, speaking of education, in my intro, we talked about where you went to college and beyond. But where'd you go to high school? You grew up in Nashua, New Hampshire.
I grew up in a mill town in New Hampshire, Nashua, New Hampshire, and went to Nashua High School. My after-school jobs were in shoe factories and tanneries, and you know, kind of mill town type jobs.
So you did not come from means.
My father worked at a shoe manufacturing company called J.F. McElwain, and my mother was a social worker, and both were very public spirited. They were very focused on giving back to the community and public service, and so that was an important lesson for me growing up.
Tell me, what type of kid were you in high school? Were you a jock, an introvert? I ask because I'm just looking to see if there's any signs that would turn you into an entrepreneur, that early signs that would indicate you're going to be an entrepreneur. And I think our audience would love to hear about that. What kind of kid were you?
I was adventurous. I wasn't a great student. I was an adventurous student. I did some sports. I love to ski. I love the outdoors. I love to hike in the White Mountains. I learned to scuba dive at an early age. I was on a swim team. I love swimming recreationally, and running and skiing. And so I was adventurous. The closest I got to falling in love with science was I was the president of my high school chemistry class, and I took advanced chemistry. And I loved how it ignited my curiosity, but I wasn't happy with my capacity to understand it all.
I'd say you learned something along the way. David, tell us something that very few people know about David Shaw.
A couple of things. One, since we were just talking about Nashua, I don't think even my kids know that I bought a car for $10 in Nashua High, took a hammer and knocked out the windows, went over to the Hudson Speedway and came in second in a demolition derby. So that was the height of my career. I also hitchhiked out to Telluride, Colorado. I grew up, like I think many of us did, enthralled a little bit with the Western frontier, with the stories of the Wild West, the adventures in the West. And here I was in a mill town with my friends, and I wanted to see and experience the Wild West. So through a friend, we found our way to a little ghost town in the San Juan Mountains called Telluride, Colorado. And we hitchhiked most of our way there, and in a little tiny house that was a bordello in the heydays of mining in Telluride, we ran a little restaurant. So we ran a restaurant called the Good Time Society in Telluride, and I really did get to experience something that I had wanted to.
Did you run the bordello as well, just to clarify? I mean, you're an entrepreneur.
Robert Redford had just filmed some scenes from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid out there about robbing a bank, which was a true story. In fact, the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid did rob a bank in Telluride, and we saw all these places were in all this mythology, and it kind of we went up into the mountains where there was a huge gold rush in the 18 after the Civil War in the 1870s and so forth, and you could feel that adventurous, pioneering spirit of the American West.
Now, speaking of the West, you're on the board of the U.S. Olympic Committee, which is in Colorado Springs, Colorado, correct?
Right. So another thing people might not know about me is I joined a group that built and completed last year a museum for the U.S. Olympics and Paralympics. So it's the first time that Team USA has had a home like that. Individual sports have had homes, but we are now the high-tech, highly acclaimed, newly opened museum to celebrate the amazing accomplishments of Team USA, both Olympics and Paralympics. Greg, I was going to mention one other thing that I found during encephalitis that people wouldn't know and that I didn't know. So I got a call from the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia from someone who had been the chairman of the Shenandoah Valley Commission for Civil War monuments there. He said he wanted to come and see me, and he thought he had some things that belonged to my great-great-grandfather.
Really?
Who was in the 10th Maine Civil War Regiment. And I was in the fog of encephalitis, and I said, I don't know if I'm game to see you and hear the story. And he said it would just take a few minutes, and it would mean a lot to him. So he drove up from the Shenandoah Valley and came into my house, and I went and got some things out of boxes that my parents had me store. And in those, we didn't really have much history about these. This man knew what everything was, and he pointed to on the table. He said, "This is your great-grandfather's Civil War uniform. He was a captain in the 10th Maine Regiment, and this is the sword that goes with that captain's uniform. And your great-great-grandfather, Elijah Morrill-Shaw, was mustered into the 10th Maine Regiment after being a manager at Bates Mills in Maine,
Amazing.
in Lewiston." And so I don't think our family knew that story. But going back to the Civil War, the Shaw family had roots in that branch of the Shaw family. And what makes it even more interesting to me is this was in the heyday of these mills, of textile mills. And think of what those days were like in Maine. When we think about the modern tech economy, this was just as transformational, or maybe more than that. This is one of the first times that people that worked in agriculture and that they came in and they had jobs working in mills. And it changed the world. Whether good or bad, it changed the world. And so my great-great-grandfather went from there to some other mill towns. And eventually the way the Shaw family got to Nashua, New Hampshire was he was hired to build textile mills on the Nashua River. So that was all learned in the fog of encephalitis.
But you remembered it.
Yeah, I made a film about it.
Okay. Why does that not surprise me? David, when it comes to business, who influenced you the most in your early years?
I would have to say that my partner, Ray Goldberg at Agribusiness Associates, was quite a great mentor in terms of learning about business. At IDEX, a number of people were, the board members were. I mentioned once before, one board member in particular really paid a lot of attention to me. His name was Robert Kinney. So Bob Kinney, the person that introduced me to the Jackson Laboratory, he joined our board as an independent director when he was CEO of General Mills, one of the country's great companies, and chairman of IDS, the big investment fund. And so Bob taught me a lot. One of the really interesting things that he taught me was when I would ask him, what would you do, Bob, if you were in my situation? Here's how I'm thinking about it and everything. So what do you think I should do? He would say, I'm sure you'll figure it out.
So interesting. He wouldn't tell you.
No, it was a transfer of trust, which I've learned in my career, where he trusted me to come up with the right answer, and he wanted me to struggle with doing the right thing. He wanted me to own that, and he was always there to talk.
David, you were what I would call a serial entrepreneur. By all accounts, it appears all of your ventures have been highly successful. However, there must be at least one deal out there that didn't turn out the way you wanted it. If so, would you tell us about it, and what did you learn from it?
There were times in every business I've been in when they weren't turning out the way I wanted or my colleagues wanted. So many failures along the way. The first product at IDEX, just to use that as an example, our first product failed. We ultimately were fortunate that our first product failed because it taught us to struggle. It taught us to come together as a team. It taught us to be critical thinkers. It taught us to listen carefully to minority opinions and dissent, and to magnify that dissent, and have more robust thinking, to engage the full brain power of all of our colleagues, and to try to see around corners, and subject our thinking to rigorous inquiry. So I haven't had one of my companies fail in total, but there's been time in virtually every company, certainly IDEX, there were times when we thought we couldn't make payroll, when competitors attacked us, when other things happened that threatened the whole business. And I think a really important lesson is those struggles are where you build the capabilities to win. And I sometimes say to entrepreneurs, don't hope that you have an easy ride. Don't hope that it's easy. Embrace the struggle, because the struggle ultimately is what you feel good about. It's like climbing a mountain.
Sure.
The struggle climbing the mountain is what makes it feel good to get to the summit. And business is like that too. So be transparent about failures, talk about them, learn from them, struggle with them, and have enough trust within your team so that everybody is willing to be honest and open about how they contribute to success.
At age 70, you're a very fit and healthy person with tremendous energy, just from my knowing you. And as a result, I think you have lots of years left. So plenty of time for business. Where do you go from here? You ever going to retire? Or do you want to retire?
Well, I retire from gigs, to use the musical word. I retire from gigs, but I've never been more excited about the opportunities. I've never been more excited about the opportunities that I'm seeing. It's a time of amazing opportunities, and at this stage in life, it's such a compelling idea to put everything you've learned to work, to do an even better job building companies, building organizations, doing things that create value in the world. And so, I'm not retiring. And for me, I think it's important to say this. I think I said it earlier. Is I don't think of what I do as work in the first place. I love what I do. And I like to only work with people that love what they do. I like to blur the distinction between work and play, so that we feel like we're playing the great game and loving what we're doing. And so I've recently funded a couple of companies that are in the carbon capture business, two right here in Maine. I funded a new company in Austin, Texas, and we think we may have the world's first platform for virucides, drugs that actually kill viruses. You mentioned the Olympic Museum. We're just a year into getting that going, and it happened in the pandemic. We have lots of opportunity to to build that organization. Site here will be launching its product soon, and I get up every day excited about all the opportunities that are available. Right here in town, we already talked about it. Ovation is on the launch pad to do amazing things, and it's fun to be there every day.
You know, I've heard it said that if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life.
Yes.
And it sounds like you subscribe to that.
Yes. I not only subscribe to it, but I try to create experiences through these business or even nonprofits so that you have a community of like-minded people that all feel that way. That work kind of isn't in your vocabulary. Right. You're doing what you love, you're loving what you do. You're working with other people that are a community of really interesting people doing worthy things.
You know, David, if you had to do it over again, is there anything that you would have done differently? Or either on your personal life or your business?
Well, I feel like I should say I should have gotten into commercial real estate.
I think you've done okay. You've done okay.
I have a couple of real estate investments, but all kidding aside, is in the tangibility of what you create in the real estate world is really appealing to me. You know, you build something and you have a building in a community and a neighborhood of people in it, and that's great. I have done the community building without
Bricks and mortar.
Without owning the real estate, but I see opportunities to do both.
David, didn't I hear somewhere or read somewhere that you consider yourself a failed writer? What's that all about?
Yes. Deep down, I'm a failed writer. In school, when I was in college, I just so admired experiential writers like Hemingway and Jack London and Mark Twain and these people that experienced the world and then shared those experiences with others. And so, yes, I'm kind of a failed writer. Not long after graduating from college, I attempting to be a writer, attempting to make a living as a writer, I wrote an article about an obscure story of some Mainers not long after the Civil War who were visited by someone who was visited by a fiery preacher who convinced them to build a boat and sell all their belongings and sail to the Holy Lands, to Palestine, and await the second coming of Christ. And this fiery preacher was a Mormon who hoped to be the head of the Mormon church when Joseph Smith was assassinated on their way west in I think, Indiana. And he was so disappointed he didn't get that job that he found his way back east and ended up in Machias, Maine. I wrote the story when I was in my 20s, sent it to Down East Magazine, and they published it. So it's called Maine's Holy Land Colonists.
And when would that have been?
That would have been 1975, mid-1970s.
Right after college.
Yeah, I've made over 200 short films now, and I do the writing for those films.
Those are stories. It's a storytelling.
And so I now do my storytelling in the form of films, and I love doing the writing for those.
Regarding the state of Maine, what's it doing right, in terms of economics and business, and what suggestions might you have for the state?
I think the state is doing a lot of good things. Whether it's tax incentives or small grants or support of that comes through fame, and I've never used many of these mechanisms. I think all of that is good. I think that they recognize now, the state and many municipalities recognize now that in the world of tech, density is your friend. And so all we have to do is look at other places where there's density of certain kinds of industries. Hollywood, famous example, right? Nashville, favorite example. Art in Miami. Industries thrive where there's high density. And we, several decades ago when I started IDEX, there wasn't much density. There was almost no density. One of the questions people would ask when you tried to hire someone was, where will my spouse work? Or if this doesn't work out for me, where will I be able to work without selling my house and moving my kids to new schools? And of course, Boston and Chicago and Silicon Valley, density solves all those issues. It's starting to get there in Maine, and that's a great thing.
With IDEX and Covetrus and
Yeah.
Ovation and other
Yeah.
companies like that.
Yeah.
Last question for you, David. Appreciate your time, by the way. For the entrepreneurs out there who are listening or watching, who believe they have a great idea and want to build a business around it, what advice would you give to a business person just starting out?
Be bold. Be disruptive. Challenge the conventional wisdom. Ask yourself what great looks like, not only in terms of what you're doing, but in the terms of the DNA of the people in the company that you're building.
Right.
So ask yourself what great looks like, and always sharpen your thinking by challenging conventional wisdom.
Sounds like good advice, David. Thank you so much for being on the Boulos Beat. I appreciate
Thank you for
coming by.
inviting me.
Yeah. David, I want to thank you for being our guest today on the Boulos Beat, a Boulos Company podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. You can learn more about David and his many accomplishments at his company's website, which is www.blackpointgroup.com. Well worth checking out. And if you'd like to learn more about the Boulos Company, please be sure to visit us at www.boulos.com. You can also find us at the Boulos Company on Facebook and LinkedIn, and at the Boulos Co. on Instagram and Twitter. And lastly, if you want to know the secret to owning real estate, it's pretty simple. Just be sure to outlive your debt. Thanks for tuning in.